Yes, the Dbacks have extra money to spend this offseason, but the free agent pitching market is looking pretty expensive. So, what should the Dbacks do? Should they pony up the money and go get a guy, or should they look at the trade market for a starting pitcher? Welcome into the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. You're listening to who? The always charismatic host of this podcast, Millard Thomas. I'm a multimedia journalist and I'm a graphic designer, so please go check out my website, millardthomas24.myportfolio.com to see all my latest work. I would not be able to do this podcast without you, my loyal listeners, sharing, subscribing, reviewing, doing all that so I could do this podcast for you. Thank you. It's free and available on all platforms, so please continue to tell your friends. One of those platforms is YouTube, so please hit subscribe to Locked On Diamondbacks on YouTube. I've been hosting this podcast since 2020. Now the Dbacks are on the precipice of one of their biggest off seasons in franchise history. We're going to be talking a whole lot about that offseason on today's podcast. I want to discuss in segment number 3 what not to do with the Dbacks rotation this offseason. I got a couple potential trade targets that the Dbacks should look at in segment number 2. But I first want to start off this pod by just talking about the free agent pitching market, more specifically the starters, and what the D-backs should do when it comes to the pitching market, because honestly, the pitching market just may be too expensive right now for this D-backs team. That's kind of the question that we're going to dive into today, because we've seen some guys already sign for some big time contracts, and it makes you wonder, how aggressive do the D-backs want to get this offseason? Of course, coming off that unexpected World Series run, they got some extra playoff revenue. Ken Kendrick has already talked about how that money is going to go back into the team and go into an on-field product. So we'll see if the D-backs put their money where their mouth is, because from what we've seen already in the early part of free agency, still not a ton of players have signed. But what we've seen so far, these starting pitchers, their contracts looking a little expensive. And the question I really have is, would it be smarter for the D-backs to go after a starting pitcher via trade than maybe ponying up one of these massive contracts? Because Sonny Gray just signed with the St. Louis Cardinals, and he got a deal way more expensive than I thought he was going to get. It was above the projected salaries if you went off Spotrac or MLB Trade Rumors. Now look, Sonny Gray is coming off a really good season, finished second in Cy Young voting, led the American League in home runs per 9 and FIP, and had 184 innings pitched and a sub-3 ERA, 180 strikeouts plus. Sonny Gray is coming off a really good season, and he's a pretty good pitcher. But do I think he's worth $25 million annually for ages 34 to 36? I do not think he is. And I'm a guy who has always been pro overpaying dudes when it's on a short-term deal. So it's I guess I'm okay with it to a certain degree, but I just think 34 to 36, he's going to be so much older. $25 million a year. He's going to be one of the highest paid pitchers in Major League Baseball. And I don't think he's as elite as the numbers and the stats he just put up from 2023. Do I think he's a good pitcher? Yes, but I never viewed Sonny Gray, even in his best seasons like last year, as a number 1 or a number 2 starter. I think Sonny Gray is an elite number 3 starter, where the D-backs got him for $17 million a year for 3 years. I would have been happy as the perfect number 3 starter behind Merrill Kelly, right ahead of Brendan Pfaadt. I would have been okay with that. But the D-backs, if they went out and gave him $25 million a year, I would have been you would have had to make Sonny Gray your number 1 starter in the rotation, because that is just way too much money. And I don't think Sonny Gray is the kind of player that should be getting paid $25 million a year. I don't think he's the kind of guy that you can trust in a postseason setting to go out there and just dominate to the level that you would expect someone making $25 million a year to do. We saw him in 2023, right? In the wild card round, he was solid. 5 innings, no earned run, 6 strikeouts. Like, that's really good. But if I'm paying you 25, you better go 8 innings in that game, right? In the ALDS, 4 innings, 4 earned runs, 5 runs allowed total. I'm just not paying Sonny Gray $25 million a year. Plus, you're not just paying him the contract, the salary. On top of that, the Cardinals are also forfeiting their second highest draft pick because he was offered a qualifying offer. Qualifying. I don't know why it sounds so weird coming out of my mouth. So because of that, if you want to sign Sonny Gray, you would have had to give up a draft pick, the second highest draft pick that you own. And I think for the Dbacks, that just wouldn't have been a smart transaction. So I don't understand why the Dbacks didn't go after someone like a Sonny Gray, because I think that's just way too much expensive for someone who I don't think lives up to a $25 million a year billing. And it's not just Sonny Gray. Aaron Nola is also someone that got himself a massive payday this past offseason. 6 years, like 172. Aaron Nola, I think, is a better pitcher than Sonny Gray. I mean, if you looked at the stats from this past year, you wouldn't say that. But Aaron Nola, again, I mean, maybe in the regular season, they're equal. But Aaron Nola, I think, is a postseason pitcher. I'm still a guy that values what you can do in a playoff setting. I do think there's players that are better in the playoffs, are better in those high pressurized moments, and there are players who kind of shrink in those moments. And I think what we've seen from the Phillies, the Bryce Harpers, the Schwarbers, the Wheelers, the Nolas, like those guys get up for the moment. So yeah, maybe they have a little bit of a down regular season, but a guy like Aaron Nola, I would definitely trust to come up big for you in the postseason. That's just a lot of money in a lot of years for someone entering their early 30s. That kind of deal usually doesn't work out for you. So for the D-backs, you have to ask yourself, how aggressive do you want to be this offseason? And Mike Hazen has already talked about he's not going to be afraid to give a pitcher a more lucrative deal. Maybe not like an Aaron Nola deal, but he said that Madison Bumgarner contract of 5 for 85, a deal like that didn't scare him. And honestly, at the time, I didn't think it was a bad deal. $15 million a year for Mad Bum, who I still considered like, yeah, maybe he was in the decline, but I still considered him a frontline starter. At the very worst, I was like, okay, he's going to be a really good number 2 starter for the D-backs at only $15 million a year, a guy who's a playoff proven guy. I thought that was a great deal. Obviously, it didn't work out, but I would not be mad at all if Mike Hazen wanted to give out another deal like that. And even the non-Grays and the non-Areolas this offseason, right? Not the tier 1 guys, even the mid-tier guys, the Kenta Maedas of the world. He's getting $12 million annually from the Minnesota Twins. Or excuse me, I think he signed with the Detroit Tigers. So even guys like him who I don't think are elite, who are solid but more back-end rotation starters, like those guys are getting mid-teens annually. Like that means this starting rotation market is going to be super expensive. And so I just want to know if it's going to be just cheaper and smarter if the D-back just go out there and acquire someone who maybe is a little bit more controllable, entering arbitration. Maybe he's already signed to a long-term deal, but maybe it's like 15 to 18 a year, not the 25 you're getting Sonny Gray. Like I do think there's pitchers who potentially have 1 year left of control or 2 years left of control that the D-backs can go out there and get. It just depends what kind of assets you want to give up, how many top prospects, the level of the prospects you want to give up. All that's in the equation. And if it's for someone who's really good with only 1 year left of control, are you going to give them the contract that they're looking for at the end of the year? So there's a lot of variables when it comes to making a deal for a pitcher on the market via trade, but that might be the best course of action, honestly, this offseason, because like I really want a Jordan Montgomery. I really want an Eduardo Rodriguez, but those deals just might end up being too expensive. Like if Erod wants 6 for 150, like I don't know if I want to give him that much money. That just seems like an exorbitant amount of money for someone who I don't think is an elite level pitcher. I think is a good mid-rotation starter, but these mid-rotation starters want front line money. That's where I'm just kind of out. But that just might be where the market is with baseball right now. That just might be what's happening with these free agent pitchers as baseball is making more money, more revenues coming in. As the years go on with free agency, these pitcher contracts just might keep going up and up because even when you're not looking at the tier one guys for highest paid pitchers in Major League Baseball right now, like a guy like I'm looking at highest annual salary, like Taijuan Walker, he's getting like 18 million a year. Martin Perez is getting like 19.6. Miles Mikolas is getting like 18 a year. Hyun Ryu is making 20 million. Patrick Corbin's getting $23 million. Carlos Rodon, when he signed last offseason, he got $27 million. Chris Bassett got 21. Joe Musgrave got 20. I think a couple of those guys are better than some of the other guys I just mentioned. I think a guy like a Musgrove or a Chris Bassett, maybe those deals made a little bit more sense. But Martin Perez, Taijuan Walker, Miles Mikolas, those guys getting over 18 million a year, that is just the climate we're in. Jameson Taillon giving 17 million, and honestly, Jordan Montgomery should clear a Jameson Taillon when it comes to contract. So it's when Taillon is getting 17 million, I can understand giving Jordan Montgomery $22 million because Jameson Taillon is just getting extremely overpaid. So maybe it's just the market we're in right now. If you want a free agent pitcher, you have to be ready to just dole out the deal. Potentially 18 to 25 million annually is what it's going to cost to get the Montgomerys and the Erods of the world. And to be honest, I'm cool with anything up to 20. If I'm going over 20, it better be for an Ohtani or Yamamoto if I'm going to break the bank. For Montgomery or Erod, I could go to 20, maybe $21 million, but anything more than that, I would get a little queasy about. Again, unless it's a 2 or 3 year deal, then you could probably reconvince me. But that's why I'm not mad at all if the Dbacks wanted to maybe give up some assets for a starter who could be as good as anyone on the market, but with a cheaper contract. I totally get if the Dbacks don't want to break the bank on one of these free agent pitchers and just go out there and acquire someone with just 1 or 2 years of control. That could be the smarter, cheaper option. And I actually have a trade in mind that could definitely bolster this Dbacks rotation. And if you want to bet that whoever the D-backs add this offseason could greatly improve their chances of winning the World Series in 2024, then you need to head to FanDuel Sportsbook right now to place that futures bet, because score early this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. My favorite thing to do is the same game parlay. Whenever the Lakers are playing, I take LeBron over in points, D'Lo over in threes, and the Lakers money line. Doesn't hit every game, but when it does, I love seeing that direct deposit hit. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right. Let's get back into the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast. Let's talk about that potential trade that I had in mind. And I will be honest, this was not an original idea. This was a trade I saw floated by David Schoenfield of ESPN, senior writer for them. And the reason I bring up this potential trade that he has here is because he claims that last year he called the Gabriel Moreno trade to the D-backs. He apparently did trade predictions last year and called Moreno to the D-backs. So he's making another call right now, prediction for the D-backs to get a big-time starter this offseason. And not just a starter, also a bat that can help out in their lineup. He thinks the D-backs could trade Geraldo Perdomo, Ryan Nelson, and Yu-Min Lin to the Chicago White Sox for Dylan Cease and Eloy Jimenez. And I'll just tell you guys right now before I dive into my analysis of that deal, I would do that deal 1,000 times after 1,000 times. I think that would be a fleece by the Arizona Diamondbacks. Listen, Geraldo Perdomo is coming off a really good season where he exceeded all expectations. His season was basically a microcosm of what the Dbacks did the entire year because this is someone that was elite in the small ball. He's someone that exceeded expectations all year, just like this Dbacks team and their philosophy. But do I still trust him as an everyday shortstop to be my guy for the next 10 years? I probably don't. I don't know how much I could really believe in the season that Perdomo really I don't know how much I could believe in the season Perdomo just had. Is it real or not? Can he continue to produce, consistently with runners in scoring position? Because that was really where he made his mark. Perdomo was arguably the best player this season when it came to coming through in the clutch, runners in scoring position. Domo was the guy you wanted at the plate, but he's still someone that I think is super limited offensively. I think whenever you lead the league in sacrifice hits, that typically means the team is okay taking the bat out your hand. So Domo, I wouldn't be too upset giving up in a deal. Ryan Nelson, that last appearance we saw from him in the postseason, he did look pretty good in that, but is he someone that I buy stock in going forward? Probably not. I do think Ryan Nelson could potentially be like a long reliever. I still think he has bullpen potential or maybe even number 5 starter potential, but I wouldn't trust it. I don't think he probably is a starter long term. Could he be a guy that still comes out the bullpen? I think his career is probably more like a Nick Martinez, Seth Lugo type where he could do some spot starts for you, but you probably want him as like an extended reliever going like 1.2 innings pitch every time he comes out the pen. I do think Ryan Nelson could be good in that kind of role. If you think he could be a potential starter for you, then praise to you, Chicago White Sox. I don't know if I see that in the future for the Arizona Diamondbacks. I wouldn't be upset parting ways with him. Then Yumin Lin is a pretty good D-backs pitching prospect, lefty. We haven't seen him on the major league level, but he seems like he could potentially be major league ready this upcoming season or the season after. So for the 3 players that the D-backs would have to give up in this deal, I don't think it would be a lot at all for a Dylan Cease, who is coming off a down season, but that is one of the reasons why I love him, because I still think Dylan Cease is elite. He was dominant in 2022. In 2023, a lot of the advanced numbers, a lot of the just raw statistics look the same to what he did in 2022 outside of just the ERA, the innings pitch, the strikeouts, the walks, the most of the stats. When you look at them, they were pretty close to what he did in 2022. Like his put away and his whiff percentage on his fastball and his slider, like a lot of that stuff really didn't change too dramatically. Maybe the biggest difference is he gave up way more hits on his slider this season as opposed to last season. And if he could decrease that, then I think Dylan Cease will be right back to where he was in 2022. I think Dylan Cease is still an elite level pitcher. And if you got him in the rotation with a Zach Gallen, a Merrill Kelly, and a Brandon Pfaadt, and Dylan Cease is your 1 or your 2, like it would be an argument with Zach Gallen. You might put Dylan Cease as your number 1, but whatever it is, if he's in your rotation now, like that just makes the D-backs a true World Series contender, and they already were, considering they just came off a World Series appearance. But you had Cease in that rotation, and it's like your rotation looks different as opposed to even if it's like an E-Rod in that rotation. If it's Dylan Cease, that's a different level of fear you have if you're an opposing batter. And Cease, one area he did struggle in this past year was he was not as good with runners on. With runners in scoring position, in those high leverage moments, his OPS allowed was near 800. He gave up like a 270 average in those situations. Like in 2022, he was shut down in those moments. Runners in scoring position, he rarely gave up any hard contact in those moments. Below a 600 OPS in those situations, below a 700 OPS and below a 200 average in high leverage moments. So Dylan Cease in 2022 was elite whenever it came to runners on the bases. He took a dip a little bit in 2023. That's because he gave up more contact, gave up a few more hits, and part of that was because his slider was hit a little bit more. But I also think the year he had with the Chicago White Sox, that organization, everything is just in disarray over there, dysfunctional. I just want to get him out of Chicago, put him in Arizona, get him with Brent Strom, and then let's see what he can do. And then also, David thinks we could also get Eloy Jimenez in the deal. That's also why I would do the deal. Not just because you get Dylan Cease, who I don't know if I've mentioned, 2 years of control, entering arbitration in 2024, doesn't become a free agent until 2026. So you at least get 2 years of Dylan Cease. As I'm recording this pod, it's actually Eloy Jimenez's birthday, just turned 27. And listen, I know Jimenez defensively can't really do anything. He's pretty much only a DH at this point. But even with that being said, he's still a righty that could do damage. And he's coming off a down year, only a 758 OPS. Of course, injuries always a problem with him. Only 120 games played, but 18 home runs in 120 games. And the numbers that I really care about, as always, runners in scoring position, 325 average, 847 OPS. High leverage moments, all right, but at least with runners in scoring position, Eloy Jimenez has been really good with the Chicago White Sox, and adding another bopper in the middle of your lineup that has raw power. Yes, he might not always be there from a health perspective, but hopefully playing DH could help him out a little bit more. But if you could get Dylan Cease in the rotation and add Eloy Jimenez, and now your lineup is like, off the top of my head, Carroll, Marte, Moreno, Walker, Suarez, Eloy Jimenez. Maybe you bring back like a Lourdes Gurriel. Then you have like Thomas and then Jordan Lawler. Like that's your 1 through 9 with Gallen, Kelly, and Cease as your rotation. Like that could just be one move that changes this Dbacks offseason entirely and just move the Dbacks into the next class of, World Series contenders, just teams, that tier 1 of teams I review in Major League Baseball. You make a deal like that, I think you move into that tier 1 of teams in Major League Baseball. So I would absolutely love to see the Dbacks pull off a deal for a Dylan Cease and a Eloy Jimenez. Now, I'll talk about some things I don't want to see the Dbacks do this offseason when it comes to their rotation. But first, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. All right. Let's get back into the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast. If you like the show, please follow me on Twitter at CareerThomas24 for my personal account, or look up Locked On Diamondbacks about Twitter and Instagram for the podcast handle. But now let's talk about what the D-backs should not do with their rotation this offseason. We talked a lot about what they should do, right? The kind of starters that they should go after, not breaking the bank, right? But what should the D-backs not do this offseason? I got 4 pillars. The first pillar is not signing anyone and just rolling with the internal options. Look, this is probably, of the 4 pillars I'm going to name, this is probably the one that's like least on the totem pole, the one that I care least about, because honestly, I think there's worse things the D-backs could do than honestly not doing anything. Sometimes the best thing you could do is not to do anything at all. So if the D-backs are like, yeah, let's just run it back, Gallen, Merrill Kelly, Fott, and then we'll round out the rotation with like a Tommy Henry or Ryan Nelson or Slade Cocconi or Bryce Jarvis. Like, I wouldn't be mad if the D-backs did that. I'll just be like, what happened to going all in this offseason? What happened to spending money? What happened to upgrading that rotation? Mike Hazen, you have said at the deadline, yeah, if I didn't get a pitcher, then this offseason, I'm definitely going to get one. It would just feel like a lot of just blowing smoke in our faces if you didn't go out there and upgrade the rotation by not signing someone or not trading for someone. But I do think there are players you could sign and players you could trade for that I would actually be more upset they were in the D-backs rotation as opposed to just having like Tommy Henry out there. So that's why this one is the lowest on the totem pole. But I would still be upset if Mike Hazen sat on his hands, did nothing, and just ran back the exact same rotation and preyed on internal development to help this D-backs team next year. Number 2, overpay for someone who I view as a red flag. Of course, my scouting and my stats and how I view baseball is probably going to be a little different. My philosophy is probably going to be a little different than how Mike Hazen and his team does things. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to be upset if the D-backs give out some long-term deal to a player that I don't have a ton of respect for, or a player who I just view as a massive red flag who potentially could be in the decline or potentially just end up being a bad deal. And so when they just know once you get to that halfway point of the season, you're like, how do I get this man off my team? Like if the D-backs went out there and gave Marcus Stroman $22 a year for 5 or 6 years, like, would you be happy as a D-backs fan? That feels like overpay for me. Marcus Stroman is good, but I don't think he's great. I think he's a little bit of an overrated player, and if he got over $20 million a year from the D-backs, it would actually make me kind of upset. Same with Lucas Giolito. You'd be kind of like betting on the bounce back with Giolito. If you gave him like 80 over 4 years, like something like that, just wouldn't make me very happy either. Like, yes, there's certain points where with those players where if you gave them a certain deal, like if you gave Stroman 12 years, or excuse me, you gave Stroman $12 million a year for like 2 years, like, yeah, sure, I would be happy with Stroman on that deal. You gave Giolito $20 million over 2 years, like total, like, yeah, I would be happy. But if you were to pay those guys what their projected salaries are based off Spotrac, or go over their projected salaries based off Spotrac, then I think I'd be pretty upset as a D-backs fan. So definitely don't overpay for someone I view as a red flag. Number 3, signing someone past their prime, guys that you can hope turn back the clock. I don't want to be wish casting on no old man praying that that dude can turn back the clock and get back to yesteryear, because guess what? Most of the time when you wish and you pray, your dreams don't come true, especially in sports. You can't just wish cast. How many times do we see it? A guy just middling year after year. We're like, oh, this is going to be the breakout year. This is going to be the year where the guy pops it, right? We do that with all these young players who we like, who maybe we've seen in the minor leagues have some potential. Like a guy like Dalton Varsho. He's probably going to be around for a while that we say, man, I can't wait till Dalton Varsho pops. I can't wait till Dalton Varsho pops. And it might just be someone who he is. And this pillar is more for old players, those guys who are like 36, 37. Like, this is more for like the D-backs sign like a Lance Lynn. And they're like, you know what? Lance Lynn was good 2-3 years ago. He can get back to that level of player. I would be pretty upset if the D-backs had that as their philosophy. Let's prey on upside with dudes who are way past their prime. I don't think that is ever smart when it comes to sports. And so I would have been very upset if the D-backs went out there and signed an old geezer praying he can look like a younger version of himself, despite not seeing that version of himself for a couple years now. And then the last pillar that I want to discuss is signing inning eaters who just take up space. I would be very upset if the D-backs went out there and just added like a Zach Davies, right? Just added someone that could get you 160 innings pitched, but you know it's just going to be mid. I do not want that. At that point, like I said, give me pillar number 1. Just give me the rotation of young guys and just run it back. I would rather do that than just go out there and sign someone to just take up space in the rotation. That would infuriate me more than probably any other pillar on this list. So D-backs, definitely don't go out there and do that. You know what I want? Add a quality starter this offseason without giving an Aaron Nola deal. Short-term overpay is okay if they're legit. And if the D-backs gave Erod or Montgomery 18 to 20 over 4, I think I would be pretty okay with that. Now that's it for this edition of the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast. Come back tomorrow for more Diamondbacks news coverage and insight. And as always, stay safe, stay healthy. Deuces.